I think it's customary that I introduce Stuart Armstrong. Stuart Armstrong is from the Future of Humanity Institute and
Hello.
Alexander Thomas Fellow, I think. And he's working in the harder, more mathematical part of AI safety. He is at least outside of the United States, he is by far the most prolific writer and, in my opinion, one of the most insightful. So I am very pleased to introduce him and welcome to the AI Safety Reading Group.
Ah, well, thank you. With a introduction like that, I definitely have a lot to live up to. But yes. So should I talk about myself or should I just plunge straight in?
Feel free to say a few words about yourself.
Okay. Well, I'm working at the FHI as Soren said, and I've been working on various ideas in AI, in like trying to ensure that you could turn off AIs and things like that. I'm generally aiming to shave off parts of the problem so that pieces of it can be considered solved. And my other way of working is if someone says, well, you can't control an AI because of A, B, and C, I'm thinking, okay, so can we hit A, B, or C separately in any way? That's where some of the ideas have come. The presentation I'm giving today was then I looked into people who are trying to do inverse reinforcement learning, which I'll explain in the presentation. And I realized there's huge problems with it. And then I formalized what the huge problems were. And this actually is leading to some interesting solutions. Right. Should I now start with the presentation, or?
Please.
Okay. So, as the title you can see, it's the claim of this paper is that you cannot learn human rationality and reward together. The cannot is an asterisk because in theory you can't do it at all. In practice, humans do it effectively all the time. So there's a very interesting question as what's actually going on there. This is based on a paper that I did with Søren Mindermann, who I believe is now in Berkeley and trying to find a PhD program there. This came from the idea of inverse reinforcement learning. In standard reinforcement learning, a human designs the reward and gives it to the agent. This might be problematic if it's a badly designed reward. So in inverse reinforcement learning, the human does some things, the expert trajectories. It extracts from it what the reward should be. The papers that have done this have made the assumption that the human is rational or noisily rational in very specific ways. And it seemed that maybe this could generalize to irrational humans. And the problem is that it doesn't. So without assumptions, you can't say anything individually about rationality or rewards. You can't say anything about rewards, and you can't really say much about rationality. Now, this is a so-called no-free lunch theorem, and there's a lot of no-free lunch theorems around in this area, and they're normally not very exciting because you just apply a simplicity prior where simple worlds are more likely, and the no-free lunch theorems go away. However, this one cannot be solved with simplicity priors. In fact, simplicity priors will make the problem worse, as we'll see. As I mentioned, humans can and do say a lot about rationality and rewards. So how do we square that with the initial claim? Well, without assumptions is the key part. So therefore, if humans are doing this, humans are making assumptions. And a question is, what are the human assumptions and can we extract them and then hand them over to AIs? But on to the first problem of defining rationality and reward. Suppose we say that a human has a preference X but isn't fully rational about them. So he sort of means that humans have the preference, but they implement them poorly. So the implementation is key. So I'm seeing a human as preferences plus implementation, or reward plus rationality, those sort of using those as synonyms. And that's how I'm seeing the human. But what can we actually observe about the human if we look at them? Well, we can observe human actions and maybe the human brain, which means we can partially observe the human policy, so the actions that humans will take in various environments. And that is what we observe. So if we formalize all that, I'm modeling the human as a pair P and R, with R a reward and P a planner. This is the implementation device. And I see a planner as mapping a reward onto a policy, P of R, like the fully rational planner is a planner. It maps the reward to the optimal policy. And there are a variety of other planners that we'll encounter. By pi h, I'm designating the actual human policy. And I'm assuming it deterministic, though that's not necessary. It's just a simplifying assumption. And a pair, P and R, is compatible if the planner maps the reward to the human policy. This means that this is a candidate for explaining the behavior of the human. And a key fact is, once you learn that P and R is compatible, there is nothing more that you can deduce about it from observation. The reason is the compatibility. So even if you're omniscient, you cannot get more information, because the planner gives you the human policy, which means the planner and reward pair perfectly predict human actions. So anything you observe the human doing will be exactly what the planner reward pair have predicted. So if you have two pairs that are both compatible, you cannot distinguish between them because they make exactly the same predictions. This is sort of the weak version of the no free lunch theorem. But let's see how bad it can get. So let's say that P0 and R0 are a compatible pair that are also reasonable. They have all the nice properties that we want. They encode what we think human rationality and reward are all about. Here are some other pairs that will also be compatible. The first one is the rational planner. There is a reward which, when paired with the rational planner, will give you the human policy. There is also an action rational planner, which just greedily takes the most effective action in the immediate without planning for the future. This pair is also compatible. Notice that they use the same reward, which we'll be presenting a bit later. And there's also the indifferent planner. The indifferent planner is a planner that maps all rewards to the human policy without caring about what they are. And if you put the zero reward, this pair is also compatible. Then we get into some rather interesting versions. You can take the negative of a planner by defining minus P of R of P of minus R. If that's the case, then the anti-rational and the anti-action rational planners are also compatible. One way of seeing this is that it's impossible to tell the difference between an R maximizer and a minus R minimizer. Annoyingly, minus P0 and minus R0 are also compatible. So even if we had some evidence in favor of the reasonable pair, there's another pair that also seems reasonable and has the reward completely reversed. By the way, for those who are wondering why I don't take the negative of the indifference planner, it's because the negative of the indifference planner is just the planner itself. Now, all of these are compatible, which means that we cannot distinguish between them from observation. So this is the point where we might appeal to the simplicity prior, to Kolmogorov complexity, except Kolmogorov will not save us here. And the ridiculous pairs are actually simpler. I put there likely simpler because Kolmogorov complexity depends on your choice of language. But for most reasonable languages, the ridiculous pairs will be simpler. To show you to give you an argument as to why is that the case, notice that all compatible pairs define the human policy. So any pair has to have a bit of a hand wavy here, Kolmogorov complexity that's higher than the human policy. So the complexity of the human policy is a lower bound in most languages on the complexity of any pair. Now this, in pseudocode, is the definition of the indifference planner. It just says return it ignores the reward entirely, and it returns the action that the human policy would give. So this planner is a few symbols longer than the human policy, therefore of very comparable Kolmogorov complexity. And as long as the zero reward is similarly short, this pair is very close in complexity to the human policy itself. The action rational planner is also very close in complexity. You just need to define the argmax function, which is basically a for loop, and then you have the rational reward function, which assigns 1 to the action that the human policy will take, and 0 to all others. Notice the contrast between the indifference pair and the action rational one. For the first one, all the complexity is concentrated into the indifference planner, and the reward is trivial. For the action rational one, the action rational planner is simple, whereas all the complexity has been concentrated into the reward function. But in both cases, they are just a few symbols above the complexity of the human policy. The action anti-rational one can similarly be defined. Now, this shows that these three pairs are simple, but why do we think that a reasonable policy would be more complicated? Well, first, one problem with the reasonable policy is that the complexity of its negative is about the same. As long as putting minus signs are simple, then the complexity of this pair and the complexity of the anti-version are the same. So we can't really distinguish between R0 and minus R0, which is a bit annoying. The other issue is that this pair, the reasonable one, defines human biases. If we can define what a bias is as the difference between the action the human take and the action the humans should have taken, so all the biases and the extent of their biases can be extracted from this pair. The other three pairs, on the other hand, do not have a conception of bias. They just don't know what it is. So a reasonable pair actually has strictly more information than those other pairs would have. So if we look at this graphically, we can see these three pairs as the sort of minimum complexity ones: action rational, indifference, action anti-rational. We have the rational and anti-rational ones that are a little bit more complex because the planner is a bit more complex to define. And somewhere up there we have our reasonable pair, and next to it our anti-reasonable pair. So simplicity will not help you here. Simplicity, as I said, will hinder you. But now let's move on to the second part of the puzzle. If it's impossible in theory and yet humans do it all the time, what is going on here? Well, humans use what I'm calling normative assumptions, though do let me know if you can come up with a better name for them. They distinguish between two compatible pairs, two pairs that map to the same policy. So they cannot be deduced from observations because they make the same predictions, yet they distinguish between them. And what I'm trying to do is to figure out how humans assess each other's goals, each other's rationality, and their own rationality. And we do it quite well, and we do it with a large degree of agreement. So the first thing that sprang to my mind was to look at shame. Shame goes with certain behaviors. People look embarrassed, they look down at their feet, maybe they redden. If you see this as purely an observation, you just notice, oh, the human is displaying these behaviors. But if you make the normative assumption that feeling shame means that something has gone bad, then you can start distinguishing between different pairs very well. For instance, you can slash the anti-rational one. You can slash all the negatives as well, because humans do not feel shame all the time, so they're definitely not messing up all the time. You can also get rid of the rational ones, because if they were fully rational, they would never feel shame. So just by making the assumption that shame is not just an observed behavior, but actually a sign of badness, we can start slicing into the possible pairs quite strongly. There's a few other things, like people model each other as having few complex emotions rather than many simple emotions. If we go for this, we can start saying that anchoring bias, for instance, is a bias. We can talk more about that if you're interested. Human narratives are also quite interesting. We have narratives about ourselves and about others, and if we take these narratives as prescriptive, then we can start also, this is also a normative assumption. Then humans sometimes say truthful things and sometimes lie, and you can train you could train in the future an agent on human statements about statements of fact, and you could figure out whether humans are truthful or lying. And then you could apply the same thing to humans talking about values or preferences. So a perfectly trained truth detector could detect what human values are by taking human statements about their values. Now, this seems a bit of in practice this might be doable, but conceptually it's a bit of a roundabout way of doing it. What does it mean that humans are lying about their values, and how does that parse? Well, this is where we get to what I think the most interesting approach, which is that humans model themselves and they model others. And we model each other as reward agents. And I'm thinking of using these models as part of the definition of what a reward is. So the human reward is, at least in strong part, what the humans model the human reward to be. That of themselves and that of others. Anyway, this is enough presentation on the paper. There's another part of the paper which is that this, just to show that the PR model can also model other things like AIs overriding human preferences and things of that nature. But I'll leave it here for the moment. And I have a few more slides that I might bring up in discussion if you want. And this is those slides are basically about why this result, which seems like a negative result, that you can't do that, actually has me slightly more optimistic about the future of AI. Anyway, thanks for listening there.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. Let me just get.
So here is, now I'm going to start with there are four problems here, and I'm going to start. And this is that human preferences are underdefined in exotic AI-chosen future circumstances. This has been in the back of my mind as a major problem. With the AI doing enough optimization power and aiming for various fantastic worlds represented by these photos here.